theme for our service, but the talk is going to diverge from that quite a lot, because I'm going to continue in our series on Proverbs, and we're going to look at one of the themes from Proverbs. And today we're going to look at anger. And we're going to be thinking about anger this morning. And we're going to read from Proverbs chapter 29, verses 6 to 23. Not all of this passage is on anger, but there is quite a bit of anger in this passage. That's why I've chosen it. There are loads of Proverbs about anger, and this is just a bit of a cross-section here. If you've got the church Bibles, it's page 467, and you can follow it in there. The version I'm reading from is slightly different, but if you haven't got the church Bibles, 467. In a few weeks' time, we will be more together with what I'm reading in the version, but the Bible's unfortunately been delayed by a few weeks, the new Bibles. So Proverbs chapter 29, verses 6 to 23. Evil people are trapped by sin, but the righteous escape shouting for joy. The godly care about the rights of the poor, the wicked don't care at all. Mockers can get a whole town agitated, but the wise will calm anger. If a wise person takes a fool to court, there'll be ranting and ridicule, but no satisfaction. The bloodthirsty hate blameless people, but the upright seek to help them. Fools vent their anger, but the wise quietly hold it back. If a ruler pays attention to liars, all his advisers will be wicked. The poor and the oppressor have this in common. The Lord gives sight to the eyes of both. If a king judges the poor fairly, his throne will last forever. To discipline a child produces wisdom, but a mother is disgraced by an undisciplined child. When the wicked are in authority, sin flourishes, but the godly will live to see their downfall. Discipline your children and they will give you peace of mind and will make your heart glad. When people do not accept divine guidance, they run wild, but whoever obeys the law is joyful. Words alone will not discipline a servant. The words may be understood, but they are not heeded. There is more hope for a fool than for someone who speaks without thinking. A servant pampered from childhood will become a rebel. An angry person starts fights. A hot-tempered person commits all kinds of sin. Pride ends in humiliation, while humility brings honour. In the film Anger Management, I don't know if you've ever seen it, it's a little bit silly to be honest, but there are some interesting truths held in the film. You've got a character played by Adam Sandler, who is the patient, and the therapist is played by Jack Nicholson. And Sandler needs anger management in the film, and that's where he goes to him from. But the interesting thing with Sandler in the film is that it isn't the fact that he's raging all the time and going crazy and there's all sorts of damage being done. It's the fact that he completely represses his anger and never gets annoyed over the things that should annoy him. So there are two types of issues with anger which we can look at as we look at this human emotion. There's the tendency to overreact, but also the tendency to almost deny its existence. And both are actually quite dangerous, as we'll look at. So anger is actually a characteristic of God. Apparently 580 times a word pertaining to the wrath of God is mentioned in the Old Testament. Indeed, it's not hidden completely in the New Testament either. So if anger is a divine attribute of a God that we see as holy and perfect, then maybe we are wrong if we think it's always a bad thing. It cannot be a bad thing, otherwise God is not good or perfect if he is also showing anger, which we see repeatedly in the Old Testament. And we see, of course, quite often even in the life of Jesus himself, who, as we know, is God made flesh among us and shows us a perfect human life. And so with Jesus, we see anger manifest in various ways. For example, he's often angry with the religious leaders like Pharisees and others. On frequent occasions, he either is angry, says things angrily, or even shows his anger in how he reacts. So, for example, if we were to look at Mark chapter 8, verse 12, we would read, that the Pharisees are demanding a miraculous sign from Jesus to test him out. And this is Jesus' response. When he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit. You can imagine it. Oh, for goodness sake. Sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, I will not give this generation any such sign." So in his response immediately, but also in his reaction to them and what he does when they ask, Jesus, I think, is showing annoyance. He's showing irritation. He's angry with them because he knows the motives of their hearts. If we were to read on a page and look at Mark chapter 9, verse 19, we read of Jesus with his disciples, and his disciples have failed to cast out a demon from a boy. And it says this, Jesus said to them, and it seems to be talking about his disciples specifically rather than the crowd as a whole. Jesus said to them, his disciples, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So Jesus even shows frustration and anger at times at his own followers. It's frustrating because they're not learning, they're not believing, they're not hearing properly what he's saying. Another example happens in John chapter 11, verse 33, in a rather surprising place. It's at the tomb of Jesus' friend Lazarus. Jesus goes to Lazarus' tomb to see him, and it says in John 11:33, when Jesus saw her, that's Mary, who is the sister of Lazarus, when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, or he was angry in his spirit, and he was deeply troubled. That seems like a strange response. I wouldn't expect Jesus to be upset. In fact, later on it does say Jesus wept. He did show sadness as well, and as we know, anger and sadness often go together, don't they? You can be sad and angry at the same time. Well, you might wonder, why is Jesus angry in such an inappropriate place? Well, I'm wondering if he was angry. Two possibilities for me. One is that it's just the anger at human sin. Because what caused death to happen, bereavement? Human sin. That's how death's come into the world. So it's a consequence of people doing wrong. And the consequence of that original sin is that the world is messed up, and there is death, there is destruction, there is bereavement, there is loss. But there's also the fact these people wailing with Mary. And we may wonder at their motives. A lot of people in those times made a big show of their holiness, made a big show of identifying with Mary and her sister Martha and their brother Lazarus, and to show how good friends they were, when you can imagine maybe they weren't, but it was all put on, and maybe Jesus is annoyed at them because he knows their motives, and he knows that they're being false, and it's not a valid response. So perhaps that's annoying Jesus as well. You can see the injustice there and the hypocrisy there. Like, Jesus hated hypocrisy, and he often railed against it. So we see Jesus showing anger on a number of occasions, quite frequent. We see Jesus actually, it's showing anger in his words or in some of his actions. So if Jesus is angry, he's God in human form, and we know that God at times is anger. There is a place for what we might call righteous anger. Anger is not completely prohibited, and it's not necessarily wrong. In fact, at times it might be the right response to a situation. But for human beings who are imperfect, so when we're angry, we always remember we're sinners. Jesus wasn't. So that is so it is to be treated with great caution. It's a very hard emotion to control, as most of us know, to our cost. So how do we deal with anger? The Greek philosopher Aristotle, and I'm going to paraphrase him very badly here, said this, and I think these were very wise words. He said, "There's nothing intrinsically wrong with being angry, but the problem with anger is how do you get angry with the right person, at the right time, in the right way, to the right degree?" And that's almost impossible to do. If we're honest about it, that's almost impossible to do. It may not be wrong to be angry, but usually our response is wrong, because it's such a hard emotion to control. James 1, 19 to 21 says this about human anger. "Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. So get rid of all the filth and evil in your lives, and humbly accept the word God has planted in your hearts, for it has the power to save your souls. So human anger is often destructive and often very dangerous indeed. And when we consider what happens when the temperature rises, when we start to get red in the face, and other people might notice when we're getting angry, when we start to feel hot and bothered, we start to lose it. Maybe the red mist starts to come down. How do we respond to these things? And there tend to be two bad responses. It's very generalising, but two bad responses. The first is the one I alluded to with Adam Sandler in anger management. The bottler, the person who bottles their anger up. They suppress it, they hide it, they pretend it's not there, they deny its existence, and they repress this emotion, which after all is an emotion which is part of our intrinsic being as created beings by God. That might look good, and that person might brag about being self-controlled. Indeed, they probably are showing self-control, but it's not ultimately going to be healthy for them, for a number of very good reasons. Because if you bottle up anger and just pretend it's not there, either one of two things happen. Either one day you will explode, or secondly, you'll get ill. Anxiety, stress, health issues, maybe even breakdowns, strokes, etc. All those sorts of things can happen when people repress their emotions, including that of anger. Indeed, we might wonder why people repress anger. There could be a number of reasons. It could be pride. Pride is dangerous whether we're venting at everyone who's slighted us in an inappropriate and destructive way, or sometimes potentially we might be proud of saying, oh, aren't I the cool person? Aren't I the relaxed person? Everyone else loses it and I'm the one who just goes on. But that's not great if you're actually repressing it, because you're going to lead to problems later. And people might repress their anger for different reasons. They might have been told when they were children by their parents, never ever lose it, never ever lose self-control, never ever make yourself vulnerable in such a way. They may have been forbidden from ever showing their emotions. And that may not just be anger, it might be other emotions as well. Some people from what we might call stoic backgrounds might be like that. Others might have had a dangerous authority figure in their lives, sadly usually the father, who they're scared of that much that they would never dare be angry because they won't want to raise the temperature or answer back or anything. So they will repress out of fear of the consequences or the reactions of others, and that might go through into adulthood as well. Other people might repress anger because of all sorts of abuse, particularly with their children. It could be physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, sadly at times, or sexual abuse. And they might choose to repress anger because it doesn't want to risk anything else coming to the surface. And so it's hidden, and it's just kept there. The problem with this, as well as leading to health issues, is that, as I've said before, there are times when it is right to be angry about things. There are times when it's actually, that is the correct response. And the person who represses their anger, when they've got every right to be angry, in fact they should be angry, they'll come across as cold and unfeeling and uncaring. And that isn't good either. That is not a good or natural response. And the other thing to say is that it's often a dishonest response as well. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18, it says this. I struggle to find one about the bottler. There's loads of proverbs about the person who goes crazy, but not so many about the bottler. But here's one. Proverbs 10, verse 18. Hiding hatred makes you a liar, slandering others makes you a fool. You know, just hiding stuff under the surface isn't necessarily going to answer anything. And then Proverbs 18, verse 19, I'll explain this in a minute why I think this particularly applies to the bottler, is this. An offended friend is harder to win back than a fortified city. Arguments separate friends like a gate locked with bars. The bottler will often walk away from relationships because they don't want conflict or a confrontation. So they will actually ruin relationships rather than maybe face or communicate or risk a confrontation or risk the temperature rising or an angry response from the other person or a loss of temper from the other person, they prefer to walk away. They prefer to, that can even happen in marriages. I'm sure marriages have been finished because someone says, well, I just don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want to risk my emotions coming to the surface, so I prefer to walk away. Rather than actually, hang on, maybe there's a way of resolving this. It might lead to an argument, but I think the offended friend often applies to that person who gets offended. They don't say anything about it. No one knows. Quite often the other person won't even know what the problem is, but they'll find the other person's ostracised them and walked off. So the bottler can often be someone who actually ruins relationships, but not with a great blow-up. They'll just disappear. The other thing a bottler often does is they sulk and give the silent treatment as well. Because again, you're not actually raising the temperature, are you? And they'll let the person know, well, that is not a good way of resolving issues, of course. And they're most likely to be the one who fails in this regard. Ephesians chapter 4, 26 and 27. Don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. And I know it gives a foothold to the devil when someone goes crazy and vents, but it can give a foothold to the devil when a person internalises it and just grows bitter inside or refuses to come to terms with the situation. And rather than maybe resolving things, they just walk off. So bottling it is quite dangerous. And of course the other one is what we might call the spewer. The spewer. The person who vents their anger at any and every opportunity. The person with the short fuse. The person who lets their anger go from a natural human emotion of anger to losing it, getting mad, going crazy. The red mist coming down. We've all seen toddlers get angry, haven't we? The tantrum of a toddler, a 2-year-old who sort of thrashes around on the floor. And sadly, adults can be guilty of that as well, with far less cause for it and far less justification. It's easy to completely lose it. The spewer will vent their anger in rage and loss of temper. Losing your temper is never actually a good thing. There must be a control to the anger. And that person is, of course, very likely to cause destruction. They'll be dangerous to be around, and they will often, they will damage themselves, they'll damage anyone around them, their reputation, all sorts of things. It's really very obvious to see, and of course Proverbs is full of advice on this. So for example, Proverbs chapter 19, verse 19, hot-tempered people must pay the penalty. If you rescue them once, you'll have to do it again. And then Proverbs 14, verse 17, there's loads of these, of course, but Proverbs 14, 17, short-tempered people do foolish things because they can't control themselves, obviously, and schemers are hated. And again, you can go through Proverbs and find more than 10 of these examples. So that person will cause destruction to themselves and others. And actually, Proverbs even says they're best avoided completely. In Proverbs 22, verses 24 and 25, it says this: don't befriend angry people or associate with hot-tempered people, or you will learn to be like them and endanger your soul. It's quite scary. And so the hot-tempered person, normally in a sort of potentially violent way, certainly violent with words, if not with actions as well, will of course do great damage to relationships and will leave a trail of destruction behind them. It will be much louder than the bottlers messing up a relationship. So how can we control and deal with anger in a good way, which doesn't avoid the fact that it might legitimately be there, but also doesn't overreact like the person spewing out their anger? And can I say about the person spewing out anger, you might say, well, isn't that healthy? They've got it all off their chest. They're vented, and therefore they can probably relax. Well, how often have you seen someone who can't control their temper lose it, and then they're fine after that, and they let it out, and that was it? No, they'll be back to getting angry again the next time something annoys them. Even that isn't a long-term answer. Repressing it isn't, but nor is dealing with it in an unhealthy way. So when we start to get annoyed, when we start to feel the temperature rising, we start to feel tense or frustrated or annoyed or wonder what's going to happen next, it's best to always think and consider what's the cause of our anger. Why are we getting angry? And is it justified to be angry? Because quite often we get angry, there is no justification at all. Sometimes there is, but quite often there is no justification for it. And I want us to do a little bit of an object lesson, and it's Jesus' probably most famous episode of anger. And if you want to follow it, you can follow it on page 716 of the Church Bibles. It's Mark 11, 15 to 17. We're giving a little bit of a study of Jesus' anger here, which is going to be interesting. So Mark 11, 15 to 17, you'll notice as you read this, that this is just after this is my small link with Palm Sunday and the triumphal entry. Jesus has come into Jerusalem. Everyone expects him to start sorting the Romans out, maybe proclaim himself king and dare the Romans to challenge him. What does it say that Jesus does? He goes into the city, looks around the temple, sees what's happening in the temple. That's very important. He goes back to Bethany, which is a few miles outside, and has time to think about what he's seen in the temple overnight. This isn't just a sudden fit of rage. He's had time to see what was going on in the temple the day before. And in verse 15, when they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. Or the footnote says here, or stopped everyone from carrying merchandise through the temple. He said to them, the scriptures declare, my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. I want to deal with those things in turn. The house of prayer for all nations first. Remember that there were not just Jews worshipping the God of the Jews in the temple, but also there were people who were Gentile, non-Jews, who had also come to worship the God of the Jews and were also able to worship in Jerusalem. So that's why we think of the house of prayer for all nations. But let's also consider this. Jesus is a young man who's a carpenter. So he'd been quite tough. He'd been quite, he'd been physically quite strong. He must have been. He's got at least 4 fishermen with him, very strong men. He's got a freedom fighter, Simon the Zealot, with him as well. And then he's got a number of others. Okay, there's 2 more soft people, probably Judas Iscariot and Matthew the tax collector. They may not have been too much worth bothering about. But the rest of them, Jesus with 12 young men, and he's gone in, he's throwing tables around, he's making whips, and he's whacking the animals, and he's physically preventing people from moving merchandise around. That's quite close to a violent protest. It's not quite there, but it's not far off. And can you imagine how intimidating that scene would have been if you were there? You wouldn't have wanted to get in their way, would you? And so it is a serious case of anger on Jesus' part. But why is Jesus angry? So as I said, the first thing relates to my temple becoming called a house of prayer for all nations. Gentiles were allowed into only the outer court of the temple. Up on the Temple Mount is an outer, quite open court. That is the place where they were able to worship the God of the Jews, who is, of course, we know, living God, the God, the King of the universe. They can worship God in there. They can't go further in because they're not Jewish. What's in there? A marketplace. People are buying and selling, changing money, and it must have been a cacophony of noise. Can you imagine coming in here and people are selling and buying when we're trying to pray, or we're trying to praise and worship God, or hear the Bible read? It would be almost impossible. You'd be, 1, annoyed about it, and 2, it would be almost impossible to do so. So these people are being a stumbling block to the worship of others. So we start to get the picture of why Jesus is getting angry about this. They're actually stopping and preventing the worship of people whose hearts are inclined towards God. That's the first element of why Jesus is annoyed. The second one, and the second and third ones together, I think, is this. It is to do with the particular nature of their business. Now, these guys could have put their business outside the temple. I'm sure they could have. In the old city of Jerusalem, they could have put it outside the temple. But there was a very good reason for them not doing it, and it was all about greed and profit and abusing the religiousness of other people and their devotion to God. So if they put it outside the temple, one, the Gentiles can worship in peace. And secondly, the people who are selling the animals won't make as much money. They won't make as much money. The reason for this is that in Rome, and of course Israel was in the Roman Empire, everyone had to use Roman currency, the denarius. The denarius had on it a piece of silver, a little piece of silver, with on one side it had the picture of the Roman emperor, Caesar, who the Romans basically worshipped, or had to worship, which was a sort of god, a deity. So you've got that picture and an image of a person, which again is sort of idolatrous in Judaism. On the other side, I think it's a picture of one of the Roman gods with some sort of inscription. So you've got something which is idolatrous and unclean, and it's there. And if the people who come into Jerusalem to give their sacrifices to God, animals or birds, for the annulment of their sins, to do the right thing before God, that was basically the primary act of their worship in those days. And many of them, of course, couldn't just bring animals and birds into Jerusalem, either because it was too far, or because they were too poor, or because they lived in cities without access to land where they could have animals. So therefore, they were dependent on purchasing these animals or birds for the sacrifice. If they could just buy them in the old city, that'd be great. There'd be all sorts of places to buy them. You buy them, you go into the temple, you pay the denarius, you go into the temple. All done out there. But no, they decide that the best thing that they can possibly do for their own profit is to move the place where people are allowed to buy the holy animals inside the temple grounds, where you're not allowed to use Roman coins because it's not holy. So what you have to do is you come in, you change your money from denarii to the temple shekel. And can you imagine the exchange rate? It'd be worse than an airport, way worse than an airport. And you can imagine that while there were more than one money changer, it was like a cartel. They'd have colluded together to make sure they all made massive money. They would have made okay money otherwise, but they want to make a big profit out of manipulating and abusing and oppressing other people, particularly the poor, actually. So they change their money and get ripped off. Then you've got to buy an animal or bird from a few privileged market lenders in the temple courts, who again have colluded together to rip everyone off, so that they then pay over the odds of the animals. And these are people trying to worship God, and they're being used and abused by those who are benefiting and profiting from them. So we get a measure of why Jesus is right now. You have turned it into a den of robbers. It really is a den of robbers. So these poor people wanting to worship God, wanting to do the right thing, are being used by people for their own ends, to make not just a bit of a profit, nothing wrong with that, but to make big money. And sadly, I would have to say, leaving the church today, that happens. There are people who make a lot of money out of people's devotion to God, and God will judge that. God will judge that, as Jesus judged it right there. And we do have to be careful about our motives. If someone is paid by the church, so I have to be careful of my own motives, my profiteering over. But certainly when you get to larger churches and organisations, that's much more dangerous. We do need to be careful. It's not just limited to Judaism 2,000 years ago. There's even the danger of people being manipulated in their worship of God by those who want to profit from it, who want to do very well out of it. We need to be wise to that. There are people even who are saying charlatans who are using that. And the other thing is, this is all being tacitly approved by the chief priests and the religious leaders. Because they can stop this. They can say, you're not doing that. That's going out into the old city. But no, they're allowing it to happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't take a cut of the profits as well. So Jesus is furious, rightly so. So we get a measure of righteous anger and an anger for a good reason. Jesus shouldn't oppress that, because he's right to confront and change it. Absolutely right to do so. And if we were to look in John's Gospel at another account of the cleansing of the temple, which may or may not be the same account, he may have had to go in a few years earlier because this was happening repeatedly, but he ends up with a robust but non-violent conversation with the religious leaders. So you can see he kept his calm It wasn't like he started letting his fist fly. He didn't keep his calm. So there was a measuredness to this anger, and it was in a controlled way. And as ever, we get our lead from Jesus. Because, as I said, some things are worth being angry about. Some things are right to be angry about and are wrong to not be annoyed about. In fact, some of the best social action projects that have been started because someone got angry. They got annoyed because of injustice or oppression or trafficking or any of these other things that are wickednesses of this world. And sometimes it's good to stand up and take a stand and call things out. And it's wrong not to do so. So there are times where you need to take a stand. Because we shouldn't just put up and accept corruption, bullying, oppression, inequality, injustice. We shouldn't just put up with those things. We should call them out and stand up for the weak, the victims and the oppressed. We should be willing to do that and maybe take a stand up. What I wouldn't say here is that should become our obsession, though. We should be careful about that. We can protest injustices, but always our primary witnesses of the good news of Jesus. But yes, we should be angry about such things, actually, and that is right, in a measured way. But we need to differentiate that right anger from an anger which comes from entitlement. An anger that can, or just trivial, silly stuff which makes us get angry, we can't control ourselves. That's not right. And in those cases, if we find ourselves getting angry just because I deserve better, because I'm important or something, some sort of sense of self-importance, we need to think again. We need to humble ourselves, because often pride and anger go together, and we need to ask God for help in dealing with it. And say, actually, Jesus, I know I've got a right to be angry. I don't know why I'm angry, but what I would say here is, Lord, help me. Help me with my unjustified anger. Remember, Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Give it to him if you're struggling with that sort of anger. And we need to differentiate between the two. Because as I say, some anger, most drivers have been in this case, if you're stuck in a traffic jam, you start to get angry. Why should you be angry? It's annoying, but why should you get angry about it? We get angry because I don't deserve to be held up. Is basically why we're getting angry. I don't deserve it. Why should I be inconvenienced? Why couldn't those people drive properly who had the accident that's caused the hold up? Or why are these people being slow and not doing their job properly on the roadworks because they're still here after however many months, which is a fairly common moment of mine. But again, that's one small trivial example of why we can be angry because we feel entitled. And that's dangerous. And our society today, and self-help books, and sadly even some measure of things that happen in Christian life, can say we're entitled to be angry. We're entitled to always be happy and always get everything our own way. That's not the gospel. Jesus doesn't promise that. It doesn't happen to him. It doesn't happen to his disciples, and we need to be careful to differentiate. There's certain things I think we need to stand against, but other times we need to actually say, Lord God, help me in this testing. Help me to stand up under it, and help me to look to you in these times. And to take my, and if necessary, to stop being so self-centered. It's very easy. A lot of anger is built on self-centeredness. I deserve better. How dare anyone cross me? Sorry, we need to stand against that and humble ourselves if that's the case. Bill Hybels wrote a book on Proverbs called Living Life Wise, I think it's called. Something like that. And in that book, he tells an interesting and very humbling story of his own self. Bill Hybels is the leader of a mega church in the US called Willow Creek. And he was telling the story of how he'd flown back from some speaking engagements in Europe, back to the US, got into the airport terminal building, and a voice came over the intercom, Mr. Hybels, can you come urgently to the airline counter? His blood freezes. There's some tragedy happened at church. Obviously, remember, on a plane, of course, the mobile phones are off, so you won't have heard what's happened. There's some great tragedy for him at church. Or something happened to my family. My wife, my children. I know they're all travelling because they're travelling back for Thanksgiving or something. What's happened? And so he walks up, shaking, wondering what sort of news he's going to get from this person. How do I deal with it? It's the worst that's happened. He gets there. And they say, I'm sorry, Mr. Hybels, but I believe that you checked in 2 bags for your flight. Only one of them's actually got on the plane. You can imagine the relief. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, well, whatever. No, it doesn't matter now. It doesn't matter. And they say, so if you can go through immigration, you need to go to the baggage carousel, wait for your bag that's coming, get that bag, and then go to the lost property counter, fill in some forms, and we'll make sure we get it sent out to you. Sorry for the inconvenience. And she goes away there, absolutely relieved, thanking God. It's not something worse, it's a small thing, really, small inconvenience. But the problem is that he gets through immigration, he gets towards the baggage control, and as he's waiting there at the baggage control, he starts to forget the fact that he should be grateful, and he starts to get annoyed. And as he waits, and it seems that it's a bit of a test, because he waits at the baggage, on the baggage carousel, his bag's about the last one to arrive, so he waits for everyone else to get their bags. And then he thinks, hang on, how come no one else was called for? How come only my bag was left off the plane? That's not fair, that's not right. And who is this baggage handler anyway? I'd love to give him a piece of my mind. And instead, his gratitude turns to frustration, anger, and annoyance and blaming. And he thinks, don't they know who I am anyway? and then he starts to be a bit annoyed, oh, come on, God, it's been a long day. To be fair to him, he's pretty tired. His transatlantic flight is tiring. And he's been a long day, and he thinks, God, I've been working for you, I've been doing all these great things and preaching and whatever, and well, why should I be the one that misses out? And why did this bag take so long? So it's held me up even further. And by the time he gets his bag, he's furious. He wants to write a letter report about the baggage handler. And he thinks, when I get to that desk, I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. I'm sure that'll make me feel better anyway. And so he's determined to really give them both barrels. In airport terminal goes, of course, invariably there's long corridors. So he's got quite a long way to walk before he gets there. So I'll give him a piece of my mind. And then it's like the voice of God says to him, weren't you grateful that it wasn't some dreadful tragedy just half an hour ago? Weren't you filled with gratitude? And now why has it changed? What's gone on? You're just getting impatient. What's going on? And you need to look at that person how I see them, who's at that counter. You keep talking about it. You keep saying it in your talk, so why are you going to live it? You're going to have a go at them. Yeah, I'm sure everyone's had a go at them, so they're doing that sort of lovely job where they get shouted at all day. And so are you going to look at them the way I look at them, or are you just going to vent because you feel inconvenienced? And he has this battle, I want to. And it goes back and forth as he's walking. But eventually he thinks, hang on, I'm not going to make a fool of myself. I'm not going to be a bad witness. I'm just going to grin, and then I'm going to walk on. And so he's made up his mind, he's probably going to do the right thing. And he gets there, and the lady greets him like an old friend, asks, and she can probably still see the tension on his face. Sorry, sir, are you having a bad day? And he says that he doesn't know how he'd have reacted if she had immediately been defensive, like, what's your problem, or something like that. He doesn't know yet how he would have exactly responded if that had happened. And the words of the lady, her greeting, may remind us of Proverbs 15, verse 1. This is good wisdom for all of us. A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. So, she does the right thing, of course, and that makes it easier for him. So God doesn't test him too much in this. And he says, it's been a bad day. And then he thinks, actually, she's probably had a worse day than me. Everyone shouts at her. He said, well, actually, it's been a good day. Just a little bit of an inconvenience. And she said, well, it's not finished yet. You've got some forms to fill out, but we will make sure it comes back to you. So he fills his forms out, hands it back, and then she says to him these words. So where do you want the bags sent? Do you want them sent to your home address, or do you want them sent to Willow Creek Community Church? What? And she says, yeah, I'll go there. Of course, remember, it's a mega church, to be fair, so you wouldn't know everyone. And he thinks, wow. So he has a nice conversation there, goes in his way. He thinks, what would have happened if I acted a different way? I've lost a church member, looked pretty bad on my reputation, and worst of all, be a terrible witness for Christ. We do need to consider how we respond to things. Are we responding in a good way or a bad way? Are we just holding fort and venting because we feel entitled? But let's also not repress anger in an unhealthy way either. And when it's right, let's actually make it. If we need to call someone out and say, look, this is why I'm upset, let's do that honestly and gently and graciously. But let's not repress, but let's not leave a trail of violence and destruction because we can't control ourselves or because we feel self-entitled. Let's live the example of Jesus